The sun had just begun to lift itself over the rolling hills, spilling gold across the sleepy town of Ash Hollow. Out on the edge of the Harrow estate, the world still smelled of dew and hay. A rooster called somewhere beyond the barns, and the first thin trails of smoke began curling from chimneys in the far-off cottages. Clara Harrow stood in the paddock, one hand resting against the warm, steady flank of Juniper, the great white stallion her late mother had once called the soul of this land. His coat gleamed even in the dim morning light, and his breath rose in slow, peaceful clouds. Clara, just 17, had the kind of face that made strangers pause, not because she was striking in a way that belonged in magazines, but because there was a softness in her eyes, a kind of unguarded honesty that felt rare in the modern world. Her hair, a rich chestnut, tumbled loose over her shoulders, and the morning wind toyed with it as she whispered to the horse. "You're the only one I can really talk to, Junie," she murmured, scratching just behind his ear, where the white mane fell into a little whirl. Juniper flicked an ear, leaning into her hand. The connection between them was wordless but certain, born from years of quiet companionship. When Clara was a little girl, she had learned to ride on him before she'd even mastered her letters. He'd been there through the night she cried after her mother's funeral, and through the long, cold silences that filled the Harrow house in the years since. From the Grand Manor's veranda, William Harrow watched his daughter with the same expression he wore when inspecting a profit report, calculating, detached. His black overcoat hung from his tall frame as though it belonged to someone else, the fabric swallowing any warmth he might have once had. At 58, William Harrow was a man known in boardrooms and across newspapers, a billionaire with the ruthlessness of a predator and the polish of a diplomat. To the public, he was the magnate who had transformed Harrow Industries into an empire spanning steel, shipping, and luxury real estate. In private, he was something colder, a man who saw people, sometimes even his own family, not as souls, but as assets or liabilities. Clara was, in his mind, rapidly becoming a liability. The news of her pregnancy had broken over the house like a sudden storm. He had not shouted, William Harrow rarely raised his voice, but his silence had been worse. For weeks now, meals at the long mahogany table had been eaten without a word. He had moved meetings, cancelled public appearances, not out of concern for her but to contain the potential scandal. Clara had wanted to tell him the truth, that she had not been reckless, that love had not been a foolish accident, and that the boy, the one she had cared for, was gone, taken by a work accident in the steel plant before he'd even known he'd be a father. But William hadn't asked. His mind was already working in numbers and headlines. She turned now, catching a glimpse of him on the veranda. For a moment, she thought, hoped, he might walk toward her. But he simply raised his coffee cup in a perfunctory nod and turned back inside. Clara pressed her forehead against Juniper's neck, breathing in the warm scent of him. "Guess it's just us," she whispered. The estate itself was a patchwork of wealth and wear. The main house, 3 stories of pale stone, looked down on acres of pasture, its windows always polished, its steps always swept. But the barns and outbuildings bore the honest marks of use, wood-worn smooth by years of hands and hooves, the scent of hay and leather in every beam. Old Samuel, the stable-master, appeared in the doorway of the barn, his limp more pronounced in the morning chill. "You keepin' him from breakfast, Miss Clara?" he called, a smile under his gray mustache. She smiled faintly. "Just saying good morning." Samuel's eyes crinkled. "That horse'd follow you to the ends of the earth, you know. Ain't seen loyalty like that since, well, since your mama's day." Clara's smile faltered at the mention of her mother, but she nodded. "He's all I've got left of her." Samuel tilted his head. "You've got more than you think, girl. You just don't see it yet." Clara led Juniper back into his stall, setting out the bucket of oats and fresh water Samuel had prepared. She lingered as he began to eat, running her fingers through his mane. Inside the manor, William was on the phone, his voice low but sharp. The words drifted down the hall to where Clara had entered, wiping her hands on her skirt. "No, absolutely not," he was saying. "We cannot let this get out. I don't care how much it costs, if the press gets wind of a 17-year-old, my daughter, pregnant, the shareholders will start asking questions about judgment, stability, family values." A pause. "Handle it." He turned and saw her standing in the doorway. There was no shame in his face, only irritation at having been overheard. "Clara," he said evenly. "You should be in your room. You need rest." "I'm fine," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "You don't need to hide me." "I'm protecting you," he replied, but the words felt hollow. "The world can be unkind." Clara wanted to tell him that the world outside might be unkind, but nothing compared to the coldness in one's own home. Instead, she nodded, knowing further words would be wasted. The day passed in a slow haze. Clara read in her room, though the words on the page never seemed to stick. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Juniper's stall was just visible from her window, the flash of white against the dark wood comforting in a way nothing else was. At dinner, William barely spoke, his attention fixed on his phone. Clara toyed with her food, her mind a storm of thoughts she couldn't quite name: fear, defiance, loneliness. She had been raised in privilege, yet in that moment she felt poorer than anyone in town. When night fell, the rain began in earnest, tapping against the tall windows like an impatient visitor. Clara lay awake, listening. Somewhere out there, Juniper was in his stall, breathing steadily through the dark. The thought calmed her enough to finally close her eyes. She did not see the way William lingered in his study long past midnight, staring at the fire without really seeing it, turning over some plan in his mind. Nor did she hear the phone call he made just before the clock struck 2, his voice low and deliberate. Yes. Tomorrow. Somewhere no one will find her. Morning broke the way a bruise spreads, slow, aching, with a purple edge of cloud lying low over the hills. The rain that had rattled the windows through the night had thinned to a mist, beating on the pasture grass and stringing the fence wire with tiny pearls. Clara dressed quietly, hands lingering on the curve of her belly the way a pilgrim touches a relic, not worship, not fear, something in between. She had dreamed of a door that wouldn't open. She had dreamed of her mother's voice behind it. Downstairs, the manor felt like a museum before hours. The kitchen staff ghosted through their routines, faces lowered. They had learned to read the weather of William Harrow's moods, and today promised storms. William waited in the foyer with his coat on and keys already in hand. He looked polished and remote, the way a portrait looks when it's been over-varnished. "We're going into town," he said, barely looking at her. "There are things to be handled." Clara glanced toward the back windows, where the barn roof shone with damp. "Juniper, Samuel said I could ride." "Not today." His tone clipped the desire off at the root. "You'll need focus." She nodded, swallowing a question she knew would find no purchase. He held the front door open. The air smelled like wet cedar and gasoline. On the gravel, the black sedan gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that suggests a car has never been anywhere worth going. William moved with the efficiency of a man clicking through calendar appointments, the rear door opened for her, closed, and the world narrowed to leather seats and tinted glass. They drove with the quiet of people who are not out to share a day but to complete a transaction. Beyond the windows, Ash Hollow rolled by, the pharmacy with its single neon sign flickering, the diner with hand-lettered pies of the day, the feed store whose porch always smelled of molasses and rope. Clara pressed her fingertips to the glass like she could lease through it into a simpler life, the kind where a diner coffee would taste like a plan and not an escape. William's phone chimed once. He didn't read the screen, just flicked it face down. "We'll take the river road," he said to no one, already guiding the car down a turnoff that led past the last ring of houses into the hush of country. The asphalt surrendered to packed dirt. Water had laid a film of silk over the ruts. Cottonwoods leaned toward one another above the road, thin leaves ticking like a clock. William's hands rested at 10 and 2, not tight. He was not a man who allowed his muscles to tell on him, but the tendons in his neck were cords pulled taut. He cleared his throat once, as if to say something that might have been human, then thought better of it and became a figure made of decisions again. "Dad," Clara said softly, surprising herself. The word sounded like it had walked a long way. I know I've made things complicated. But I'm not a scandal. I'm your daughter." He kept his eyes ahead. "You are 17. I know my age. And you are pregnant." She folded her hands on her lap to keep from wrapping her arms around her stomach in instinctive defense. "Yes. It can be corrected." He said it the way he might say a shipment could be rerouted. The road dipped. A fringe of reeds appeared, trembling with raindrops, then slid out of frame. "Corrected?" Clara repeated, the word brittle. "We will place you somewhere private for a time. A home for girls like you," he added, "and the like you cut deeper than any surgeon could. They will see to things. Quietly. Discretion is paramount." Clara stared at his profile, at the way his jaw worked minutely, at the way he avoided the mirror as if it might show him something he'd have to carry. "You mean you'll disappear me," she said. The calm in her voice made him glance at her, surprised, then back at the slick road. "It is temporary," he said. "This family cannot absorb." He stopped, as though the word had chosen itself poorly. "You will thank me when you are older." She turned to the window. The river shouldered close now, brown and quick, pushing fistfuls of foam around snags. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a wordless alarm had begun to ring, not loud, not yet, but certain as dawn. It wasn't just a plan. It was the air around William today, the way it felt like an empty church would if someone had blown out all the candles. Back at the estate, Juniper tossed his head, snorting at the dampness, at the itch under his bridle path where the rain had raised his skin into little ridges. Samuel had loosened the stall chain and was mucking the aisle, whistling through the gap in his front teeth. He paused when Juniper shouldered the door with more insistence than usual. "You're not the pushy sort," Samuel muttered, palm on the white blaze between Juniper's eyes. "She's gone a bit, lad. She'll be back. Hush now." He slid the chain tight again. Juniper craned his neck to look past him, toward the hill where the lane ran. His ears flicked, catching a note in the day no one else could hear. On the river road, the sedan slowed. Clara felt it in her bones before she saw the reason, the turn-off to a maintenance path cut between two berms, its surface a fringe of damp clay. It led down, not up. Toward the sound of water. William clicked on the signal out of habit, an absurd courtesy, like saying please before a theft, and guided the car into the narrow track. Saplings brushed the doors with a squeak. The river showed itself in flashes then vanished again behind reeds and deadfall. After 100 yards the track ended where the earth had collapsed years ago into a shallow ditch, now slick with mud and grass. Someone had tossed broken concrete there once to keep it from swallowing more of the road. The slabs lay at odd angles like the bones of a thing that hadn't come together right. William put the car in park. The engine ticked, exhaling heat. There were no other sounds close by, no other engines, no voices. Just the river insisting on its business and a distant hawk making a long, disapproving circle. "Get out," he said. Clara did not move, not at first. She watched his hands on the wheel. They were beautiful hands, or they had been once, with long fingers that had held her bike seat when she was 6 and leaning too far toward fear. Those hands now unclasped from the wheel and opened her door with an efficiency that had nothing to do with tenderness. "I don't understand," she whispered, but she did. The understanding was not a thought, it was a tide coming in. "You will remain here for a short while," he said evenly. "Someone will come." "Who?" "A driver," he said, as if the word could be an answer to any moral question. "He will take you to a private residence. They are professionals. It will be handled." He stepped back. The air in the doorway of the car was cold, as if the day itself had caught a chill. Clara swung her legs out. Her shoes sank a little in the mud, making that soft kiss sound mud makes when it lets go. She put a hand on the doorframe and stood. The river was close enough that she could smell its iron. She swallowed, slow. "Dad," she said, trying one last door, "please don't leave me here." He glanced at the road behind them, at the bend that kept them from being seen from anywhere. His face made a shape that might have been regret, or a rehearsal of regret, then smoothed. "This is necessary." He reached for her elbow, not unkindly, guiding her down the shallow incline to the ditch as if escorting her into a pew. The grass here was slick and cold, at once fresh and rotten. He positioned her near one of the concrete slabs. "Stay here," he said. "Do not climb up and flag anyone down. That would defeat the purpose. Do you understand the words discretion and sacrifice?" She stared at him. "Do you understand the word father?" A muscle jumped at the corner of his mouth. "You are overwrought." He turned, shoes whispering in the wet grass, and climbed back to the car. For a second he looked down at her from the lip of the ditch the way a man looks down at a tool he has set aside. He closed the door. "Dad," she said, the word breaking. "William." For a breath, the engine did not start. The world held itself perfectly still, a coin spun on a table waiting to decide a face. Then the ignition caught, and the sound of the engine, low, expensive, untroubled, filled the dip like a hymn sung in the wrong key. The car reversed, tires spitting small pebbles, it nosed toward the maintenance road. Clara stumbled after it, but her shoes slid and she went to her knees. Mud took her like a lover who didn't know when to stop. She clutched the edge of the concrete slab and hauled herself back up enough to see taillights disappear into trees. For a moment she did nothing but breathe. In, out. The rain returned with the care of a nurse, laying cool fingertips on her face. Her heart made the hard, hollow sound of a fist on a locked door. The river kept talking to itself, patient and absolute. She tried to climb. The ditch was not deep, not in the way of the bad stories, but mud does not care about depth when it has angle on its side. Twice she made it halfway up only to slide, claw marks appearing like parentheses beside her. On the third try, she got to the lip and reached for the weeds at the top, they tore like wet paper. She went down, hard, catching herself with her left hand. Pain flared at the heel of the palm and shot up her arm. Her stomach cramped, sharp, then dull, then sharp again. She folded over with a gasp, pressing both hands to the place where the cramp became a knot. Breathe. Just breathe. She'd read that somewhere. She made herself do it, counting. The knot eased. The world came back in pieces, the smell of iron, the taste of dirt, the thread of hair stuck to her mouth, the distant hawk now gone. At the estate, Juniper had turned his body into a question mark. He pushed at the stall chain with the polite insistence of a gentleman at a door that should never be locked. Samuel swore softly and came, hand already reaching to soothe. Easy now. What's got into? He stopped. Juniper's eyes were wide, not with fear but with a kind of hot clarity. His ears flicked, then leveled forward. He stamped once, not nervously but decisively, the way a man might put a palm flat on a table to end a discussion. All right, Samuel said, more to himself than to the horse. He unhooked the chain. Juniper did not bolt. He stepped into the aisle with care, as if not to embarrass anyone, then turned his head toward the open end of the barn where the gray morning hovered like a held breath. Hold up, Samuel called, but there was no anger in it. He was already reaching for a halter when the barn door rattled with a little gust. For a heartbeat the morning and the horse measured one another, and then Juniper went, not a gallop, not yet, but a long, decisive trot that gathered itself into purpose by the second step. On the river road, the quiet acquired teeth. The mist thickened, the way it does when a day decides to test you. Clara's hair clung to her temples. She shifted on the concrete slab to keep from sinking further, each movement making the baby roll, not in panic but in the slow, fluid way that always reminded her of Titipools. I've got you, she whispered, and realized she was speaking to two lives at once, one inside, one choosing her right now, the other somewhere out there putting distance between them like money between bank accounts. Minutes pooled and overran their banks. A truck hummed hours away or a mile away, it was impossible to tell. She listened hard, suddenly afraid of wanting help so much she would invent it. The sound faded. She leaned back against the slab and closed her eyes, not to sleep but to go somewhere interior where time had different rules. She saw the kitchen's yellow lamplight, Samuel's rough hands cupping oats, Juniper's breath painting winter on the stall door. The sound that finally came was not a truck or a chorus of rescuers. It was the low, familiar percussion of hooves on damp ground, magnified by the hollow where she sat. The rhythm was steady and clean, not the scrabble of fear. It came from the direction of the main road and then slid out of sight behind the berm. Junie, she said, because who else in the world had ever come when she called without asking to see a ticket? Hooves clinked against stone. Juniper's head appeared above the lip of the ditch, white against the gray like a flag that had chosen not to surrender. He blew out a breath, soft, disbelieving, relieved, and cocked his head to get both eyes on her. For a second his ears flicked back at the noise of the river, forward at her, back again at something only horses can hear. Then he stepped carefully down the slope, setting his feet in places that wouldn't give. Clara laughed then, a sound that collapsed into a sob without changing shape. You ridiculous, wonderful creature, she said, holding out both hands. He went to her, lowering his huge head until the soft place above his muzzle pressed against her sternum. He was warmer than the day had any right to be. His breath filled the hollow of the ditch with a sweetness that belonged to summers and clover. You can't carry me up, she murmured, fingers searching his mane more for courage than for leverage. I know. I know. He shifted, planting one forefoot higher, making himself a ramp more than a ladder. She tried once, twice. On the third try, guided by the simple geometry of trust, she got her chest across the slope and her knee to the lip. Juniper leaned just enough to hold her against sliding. She crawled the last foot on elbows and reached back like a child, palm open. He touched it with his muzzle, a signature sealing a pact. On the high ground, the world widened a fraction. Juniper came up behind her in one smooth surge, hocks coiling and releasing like springs. He stood with his body between her and the road, eyes on the bend where a car might reappear. He was mud to his knees and proud because there are kinds of pride not taught at schools. Clara swayed. He moved into her. His shoulder became a wall that held. She took 2 breaths against his neck. The rain decided to pause, the way a scold pauses to see if the child is understood. Somewhere a crow hurled a rude opinion into the day. Somewhere upstream, a log struck a rock and the sound went out across the hills like a bell that doesn't care what it calls to. We can't stay here, she said. He did not argue. She took a handful of mane near his withers and walked, one step and then another, feeling every inch of the child's weight and the land's tilt and the foreign legibility of her own strength. Juniper matched her rhythm the way a good song matches a road, no hurry, no drag. They found the maintenance path, then the main lane. tracks chevron the mud, a recent set aimed away. Clara looked at them without hate, because hate is a muscle and hers was needed elsewhere. Juniper lowered his head to the ruts, sniffed at the specific mud chemistry of that ditch, committing it to some map behind his eyes that had no paper equivalent. He snorted once, a decision written in steam. Home, Clara said, because where else can a person go when the world has shrunk to the size of a betrayal? Juniper flicked an ear and began to move. And because the world is rarely kind but sometimes exact, the thing William Harrow had not considered as he turned the sedan back toward a boardroom life, the one he could control, was this: loyalty leaves a physical residue. The ditch's clay had its own red, faintly metallic tint from the iron in the riverbank. It was already drying in lines across the sidewall of his rear tire, in the lip of the wheel well, in a spray that made a low arc across the undercarriage. It would not announce itself loudly. It would whisper to anyone who knew the land's grammar. It would cling under the car like a conscience you could not vacuum. By the time Clara and Juniper reached the first real stretch of the river road, the rain had turned to a mist so fine it only existed when it touched eyelashes. The day opened a little, like a reluctant hand. Behind them the ditch waited, and in it were Clara's sliding prints, the scrape of a palm that had chosen not to bleed, the impression of a concrete edge that had finally held. Ahead of them, the town lay somewhere you could get to on foot if you had to, and the barn lay somewhere a horse could reach more quickly than any car could reverse its choices. Juniper lifted into a careful, floating trot that let Clara keep pace. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had seen enough. By the time Clara and Juniper reached the far curve of the river road, the mist had thickened into a pale curtain. It softened the trees into silhouettes and muffled the sound of their steps, as if the land itself was trying to hush the scene. Clara's fingers curled into Juniper's damp mane, her knuckles whitening each time her knees buckled. She was shivering now, not violently, but in that steady, rhythmic way that speaks of a body losing its hold on warmth. Every step was deliberate. The road wasn't rough, but the rain-slick clay demanded balance, and Clara's strength ebbed faster than she wanted to admit. Juniper stayed so close that her hip brushed his barrel with every stride, his head lowering to match her pace. His eyes flicked toward the sound of distant water, then toward her, weighing which danger deserved his attention more. The stable wasn't far as the crow flies, but the route twisted like a snake, and with each bend came the quiet uncertainty that maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't make it before exhaustion claimed her. At the Harrow estate, Samuel had noticed Juniper's absence almost immediately after the horse had slipped from the lane with Clara at his side. He'd stepped out into the yard, scanning the horizon for the flash of white against the sodden fields. That fool animal, he muttered, but there was no malice in it, only worry. Years of tending horses had taught him that Juniper wasn't the sort to wander. If he was gone, there was a reason. He saddled the chestnut mare, Lily, with the efficiency of a man whose joints ached in the cold but whose heart moved quicker than his body. The rain bit through his jacket as he urged her out of the yard and down the lane, eyes searching for fresh hoofprints. Meanwhile, Juniper's ears flicked toward a sound that didn't belong to the morning, a low hum, faint, but drawing closer. Clara's grip tightened on his mane. A truck. It appeared around the bend, a battered farm pickup, its headlights blurred by mist. Clara froze, her instincts tangled between hope and fear. What if it was someone kind? What if it was someone like her father's driver? Juniper shifted subtly, placing himself between her and the truck's path. His tail swished, not in irritation but as if to say, "You stand behind me now." The truck slowed as it neared them. A man in his 60s leaned out the window, weathered face framed by a frayed cap. "Clara Harrow? That you?" Her breath caught. She knew him, Mr. Dunley, who owned the feed store. He'd been a friend to Samuel for decades. "Yes," she managed. "Please, I need to get back to the estate." Dunley's eyes swept over her pale face, her mud-streaked skirt, the way she clung to the white stallion like he was the last solid thing in the world. His voice softened. "Get in, child." She shook her head immediately. "No. We walk." Her gaze darted to the truck bed, imagining hands, ropes, a detour she couldn't fight. Dunley frowned but didn't press. "All right. I'll follow behind, make sure no one bothers you." And so they walked, the truck rumbling slowly in their wake. Juniper didn't like the noise, but he tolerated it, just as he tolerated the weight of Clara's leaning against him, step by halting step. By the time they reached the outer pasture fence of the Harrow estate, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and smelling of wet earth. Dunley gave a two-fingered salute and turned the truck back toward town. Clara watched him go, her chest tightening with an odd mix of relief and regret. She didn't have the energy to wave. Samuel was already there, leaning against the gate, relief plain in his eyes when he saw them. Lord above, he breathed. What happened? Clara shook her head, lips pressed together. She wasn't ready to explain, not yet. Samuel took one look at her trembling legs and didn't ask again. Let's get you inside. He reached for her, but Juniper shifted, pressing closer to her side. Samuel huffed. Fine, lad. Have it your way. Just don't trample me in the doorway. Inside the dim warmth of the stable, the smell of hay and leather was almost enough to make Clara's knees buckle. Samuel brought a stool, and she sank onto it, hands still tangled in Juniper's mane. He stood over her like a sentry, every muscle alert. You're half frozen, Samuel muttered, fetching an old blanket from the tack room. He wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool scratchy but blessedly warm. You need the clinic. Clara flinched. No clinic. Samuel studied her for a moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then at least sit still while I get you tea. When he left, the stable seemed to grow quieter, the only sounds the soft huff of Juniper's breathing and the occasional creak of wood as he shifted his weight. Clara reached up to touch his cheek. You came for me, she whispered. I don't know how, but you did. Juniper blinked slowly, as if he understood more than she could ever put into words. That night, Clara stayed in a small loft above the stable instead of the house. She couldn't face the hollow silence of the manor, not after what had happened. Samuel didn't argue, he simply brought up extra blankets and set a lantern on the floor by her bedroll. Juniper's stall was directly below. She could hear him moving sometimes, the soft clink of a hoof against wood, the low sigh that seemed to carry more comfort than any lullaby. But sleep didn't come easily. Images looped through her mind, the ditch's slick mud under her hands, the look in her father's eyes as he turned away, the way the car's taillights had disappeared like they were erasing her from their world. When she did drift off, it was to the steady rhythm of Juniper's breathing below, a reminder that not all good things leave. 2 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. Samuel made sure she ate, though she had little appetite. She avoided the manor entirely. Word in town began to stir, nothing sharp yet, just whispers that Clara had been seen walking the river road in the rain, Juniper at her side. But it was Juniper's behavior that began to unravel the rest of the truth. On the third morning, Sheriff Allen stopped by the estate. He'd been a family acquaintance for years, often sharing a drink with William at fundraisers. His boots tracked mud onto the pristine veranda as he asked, "Mind if I take a look at the car?" Routine matter, had a report about a sedan on the river maintenance road 2 mornings ago. William's jaw tightened. Nonsense. My car hasn't left the main roads. But Allen crouched by the rear tire anyway, running a finger along the arc of dried clay in the wheel well. It came away with a reddish tint, unmistakable to anyone who knew the land near the river. Funny, he said, this is ditch clay. Same as down by the collapse. William said nothing. His silence was the kind that had bluffed many men into retreat, but Allen was not most men. Back in the barn, Juniper had been restless all morning. He paced his stall, ears swiveling toward any sound from the main drive. When the sheriff's truck rumbled closer, he stilled, head high, eyes bright. Clara, from the loft, watched as he gave a low, insistent nicker. Something in that sound drew Allen away from William's empty assurances. He walked to the barn, boots sinking into the damp earth. Juniper stepped forward immediately, head over the stall door, muzzle brushing Allen's shoulder. The sheriff glanced down and noticed it, still there, faint but telling, a crust of that same red clay clinging to the edges of Juniper's fetlocks. Clara, Allen called gently. She came halfway down the loft ladder, stopping when she saw who it was. I think we need to talk, the sheriff said, his tone steady. About the ditch. About how you got out. Her eyes flicked to Juniper. The horse stood like a monument, calm but unmovable. She knew then that whatever happened next, the truth was already finding its way to daylight. That night, the estate felt different. Not because William had been arrested, he hadn't, not yet, but because the silence was shifting. Whispers had left the safety of closed rooms. People in town were asking sharper questions. And in the barn, Juniper stood watch as always, his white coat catching the moonlight through the half-open door. Somewhere beyond the hills, the river moved on, but here, in this small pocket of land, the current was beginning to turn. By late afternoon the mist had burned away, leaving the kind of sharp western light that shows every truth and fault line. Sheriff Allen returned to the estate with a deputy and a camera that looked older than both of them. He spoke with the practical gentleness of a man who knew when to be soft enough for the truth to surface. I'm not here to hurt you, he told Clara in the barn aisle. But I need to know where it happened. The place has a way of talking, if you let it. Clara stood beside Juniper's stall, one hand in the white mane like a bookmark keeping her steady. "I can take you," she said, then faltered. "I'm afraid I won't make it on foot." "You don't have to," Alan said, tipping his chin toward the stall. "Looks to me like you already have a guide." Samuel, leaning on the half-door, huffed. "He'll go, Sheriff." "Fella's been staring down the lane like he's waiting on orders." "Not orders," Clara whispered, fingers tightening. "Permission." Samuel fetched a halter and lead rope, but when he stepped into the stall, Juniper moved past him with the careful courtesy of a large animal who knows his own size. Alan stood still until the horse came to him. They regarded one another for a beat, the sheriff's weathered eyes, the horse's dark, full of a patience that wasn't passive, and then Alan held the lead out to Clara instead. "You take him," he said. "I'll follow." They didn't saddle. It wasn't a ride, it was a walk that felt like a vow. Samuel tucked a spare blanket around Clara's shoulders and pressed a canteen into her hand. "Slow is fine," he murmured. "We're not outrunning anything worth outrunning." They left by the back lane where the pasture fence gave way to scrub and cottonwoods. Juniper set a pace just shy of brisk, checking his steps when the ground turned slick. He didn't look back to see if Alan kept up. He measured his speed against the rhythm of Clara's breath, slowing when it hitched, easing forward when it steadied. The deputy trailed with the camera, pausing to photograph anything that looked like a clue, though he didn't know yet what counted as one. 2 bends in, the smell of river iron rose again. Juniper's ears came forward. He veered off the main lane without tugging, angling toward a maintenance path half swallowed by grass. Alan said nothing. He knew a trail when he met one, even if it wore a horse's mind instead of a boot heel. They came to the place. No one spoke at first. It was smaller than it had felt to Clara yesterday. Grief does that, magnifies the stage until every cruelty is monumental, but it was still the same ditch with its ragged concrete bones and red clay slick as wet paint. Juniper stopped at the lip, head high, then stepped down with the same measured care he'd shown when he'd gone to her before. He nuzzled the slope where her palms had dug, then lifted his head to touch Clara's shoulder. "It's here," she said quietly, as if the place might be sleeping. Alan moved like a man in a church. He knelt, not minding the mud that patterned his knees, and studied what the afternoon had preserved, the slide marks where a body had tried to climb and been denied, the crescent of a knee, the smear where a palm had skidded and caught. He photographed the concrete slab's edge where fabric threads, blue-gray, like Clara's cardigan, still clung like cobweb. He collected the threads with tweezers, tucking them into a paper envelope the way a librarian saves a page number for later. Then he walked the perimeter in widening rings, eyes on the ground. He found what he had hoped to find, tire impressions in the soft earth, not deep, good tires, expensive rubber, but clear enough to show the sipes and blocks and a small irregularity along the shouldering ribs where a pebble had caught the tread. He set a folding ruler beside each track, photographed them, then pressed a foam cast into the clearest one. When he lifted the cast, the pattern transferred in neat relief like a confession written backwards. "Clara," he said, turning the cast so she could see, "your father's rear right tire has a nick, here. I saw it earlier today." She swallowed. "You already knew." "I suspected," Alan corrected gently. "The land just wrote it down for me." Juniper, ears twitching at a fly that had no business being so bold, stood with one hind foot resting, the posture of a horse at peace, and then, as if remembering, shifted to put all 4 feet down, eyes scanning the bend of road beyond the berm with a fixed attention that said he expected an arrival. For a second Clara imagined the black sedan sliding into view, the taillights turning like eyes. She reached up and scratched the soft inside of Juniper's cheek where his hair swirled. The skin there was warm, the pulse steady. "Clara," Alan said after a long while, "I need to ask, will you make a statement? You don't have to do it now, and you don't have to do it alone." She looked at him, then at the ditch, then at her own hands, which were not shaking anymore. "I will," she said. Not just for me. For him." Her fingers grazed her belly. "And for the truth." Alan nodded once, a short, solemn acknowledgement. He took one last photograph, the ditch, the slope, the concrete edge with its threads gone, the river beyond, then looked at Juniper. "You did good," he said simply. Juniper lowered his head as if to accept neither praise nor argument, only the fact of a job not yet finished. As they turned to leave, he hesitated, pausing at the edge of the maintenance track. He sniffed along the ground, then moved off the path to a patch of crushed grass beside a stump. Alan followed, curious. There, half hidden in the flattened blades, lay the kind of thing men never plan for, a small, glossy rectangle of black plastic, a broken corner from a license plate frame, the kind dealers screw on as a free advertisement. It bore a white serifed H, the first letter of Harrow Automotive Holdings' in-house showroom. Alan bagged it without comment, but his eyes met Clara's, and something like relief and sorrow passed between them in equal measure. When they reached the lane again, the deputy jogged ahead to fetch the cruiser. "What now?" Clara asked. "Now I go write this down in the language the court understands," Alan said. "And then I come back with a warrant, and a few more questions that won't take no for an answer." They didn't get as far as they expected before the town brought the next scene to them. Word moves in a place like Ash Hollow the way water finds its grade, inevitable, quiet until it isn't. By the time the sheriff's cruiser rolled past the diner and the feed store toward the courthouse square, a small crowd had formed, shopkeepers with sacks still in hand, ranch hands with dirt on their knuckles, mothers with dish towels thrown over their shoulders. They weren't there for spectacle. They had simply stepped out of their doors to look at the weather of their town. William Harrow, summoned by a call he thought he controlled, arrived almost on the sheriff's bumper in the black sedan that spent most of its life being admired. He got out with a face arranged the way a man might arrange a press conference, calm, sympathetic to someone's plight without ever imagining the someone might be him. He had changed his tie. He had not changed his mind. "Alan," he called, voice carrying. "I heard you wanted to see me. I trust we can resolve whatever misunderstandings have upset my daughter." Clara stood in the shade cast by the courthouse eaves, Samuel at her elbow. She hadn't intended to come, but Alan had asked, and there are moments when a person must witness their own story entering the record. Juniper stood beside her without a rope, the crowd making way the way crowds do around things that compel respect. "Misunderstanding?" Alan repeated, raising his brows. "That's a word for it." He didn't raise his voice, but the square went quieter. "Mr. Harrow, I need to ask you some questions in front of folks who can hear both the asking and the answering." William smiled the way men who are used to winning smile, warmth lacquered over iron. "If that's what helps, Sheriff. I've nothing to hide." Alan nodded slowly. "Then you won't mind if I start with your car." He gestured, and the deputy knelt by the rear wheel well with a pocketknife, scraping gently at the seam where the fender curved toward the bumper. A red dust flaked into a sample bag, duller now that it had dried, but unmistakable to anyone who spent time near the river. "Clay from the collapsed ditch," Alan said. "Same hue, same iron grit. I found the same clay on this horse's fetlocks yesterday morning." He rested a hand briefly on Juniper's neck. "I also found it at the site where someone slid down and tried like hell to climb out." Murmurs ran through the crowd, not jeers, not yet, but the low-voiced sound of people doing the arithmetic of conscience. William's smile didn't falter, it retreated a half-step. "Sheriff, we live by the river. Clay gets everywhere. As for my daughter's situation," he spread his hands in a gesture meant to telegraph sorrow. "She's confused. She's unwell. I was arranging discreet care. To protect her." Juniper shifted, the faintest movement, and placed his body forward half astride. He didn't menace. He simply reoriented the scene around himself and Clara, drawing a straight line between the two that left William just outside the geometry of belonging. The crowd's attention followed the line. Alan took a breath that sat low in his chest. "Mr. Harrow, you'll want to hear the rest. There's a broken piece of your showroom plate frame out on the maintenance path by the ditch." He held up the bag chart so everyone could see the serifed H. "It matches the fracture on your plate." He pointed at the sedan, where the lower right corner of the frame was missing a neat triangle. People drifted closer because people are always drawn to the place where talk meets proof. "And these," Alan continued, lifting the cast he had made from the tire impression, "are your rear right tread blocks. Note the little cut here." He crouched and rolled the cast against the tire, aligning the nick. It clicked into place like the last piece of a child's puzzle. William's mouth went thin. "You're making a circus out of mud." "No," Alan said, voice even. "You did that. I'm just naming the animals." "Sheriff," William said, dropping warmth and going to iron at last, "I will have your badge for this." Alan's eyes sharpened. "You'll have to stand in line. But first, you'll answer to the charge of abandoning a minor in a hazardous condition with intent to conceal and coerce medical decisions. You'll have the right to counsel. You won't have the right to rewrite yesterday." Silence, deeper now. A wind moved through the square, rattling the courthouse flag until its stitching popped once like a knuckle. William looked from face to face and saw, perhaps for the first time, not shareholders but neighbors, not an audience but a jury he hadn't selected. He seemed smaller in that moment, like a man who has stood on the deck of his own reputation so long he forgot how high the dock truly was. "Clara," he said suddenly, turning toward her with urgency that might have been genuine if it hadn't arrived so late. "I did this for you. You're not ready, this ruin. Clara stepped out from the eaves shade because stories told in the light are harder to misquote. Juniper moved with her, a light flank at her shoulder. You left me in a ditch, she said, the words plain, carved clean of decoration just by telling the truth. Whatever you say you meant, you did that. And she touched Juniper's cheek, was ready. He did not think about ruin. William swallowed. For a heartbeat his eyes shone with something that looked like a memory breaking free, Clara at 6, teetering on a pony while he ran beside, both of them laughing. Then the light went out behind his gaze, shuttered by habit, by fear, by a life built on control. You're hysterical, he said. You've always been. Careful, Alan cut in quietly, and in the quiet the word carried more force than a shout. He turned to the deputy. Ben, read him his rights. The deputy did, voice steady over the rustle of people shifting their weight. As the words unspooled, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, Juniper lowered his head until his nose almost touched William's chest. The billionaire went absolutely still, as if the horse had become a mirror reflecting what he had tried not to see. Juniper didn't bare his teeth or flare his nostrils, he simply stood there, breathing, unblinking, and in that soft, insistent way horses have of telling the truth without language, he placed a weight on the moment the man could not dodge. Sir, the deputy said finally, please turn around. The cuffs clicked, small and loud. A single sound from the back of the crowd, someone's indrawn breath, told the story of the square's heart. They didn't drag William. They walked him. That was important. Dignity is not the same as innocence, and Alan believed in preserving what could be preserved, even at the end of a long accounting. As they reached the cruiser, William glanced back, not at Alan, not at the crowd, but at Clara. The look begged for a different past. She did not look away. He got in the car. When the cruiser door shut, the square exhaled. Some people turned immediately, embarrassed by having seen something that intimate break in public, others lingered, faces open, unsure what to do with their hands. Samuel took off his hat and ran a thumb along the sweatband. Never thought I'd see the day, he murmured. Clara's knees unlocked. She hadn't noticed they were locked. Juniper took a half step, closing the small distance the world had tried to put back between them. She pressed her forehead to his, breath tangling with his breath until her heartbeat stopped stuttering. Alan approached, hat in hand now that the hard part was underway. I'm taking him to the courthouse, he said. He'll be arraigned tomorrow. We'll send a nurse to check you over if you'll let us. Not the clinic, if you don't want, Marta Gable, the midwife. She makes house calls. Clara nodded, the relief sudden and immense. Thank you, she said, and then, because the day had taken so much and left so many jagged edges, she surprised herself by adding, I don't hate him. Alan's mouth tilted. Hate is heavy, he said. You've got enough to carry. A boy from the feed store, no more than 12, edged close, eyes locked on Juniper with a reverence usually reserved for stained glass. Ma'am, he ventured. That horse, he knew. He did, Clara said simply. He remembered what mattered. The square thinned. The sun, bending toward evening, threw long shadows that merged and unmerged as people drifted back to their routines. Life, rude and miraculous, resumed its small noises, the diner door chime, the slap of a screen door at the hardware store, the distant, stubborn bark of a dog with opinions. Alan's deputy pulled the cruiser out. William Harrow, looking suddenly like a man in a suit borrowed from someone else's life, stared straight ahead. No one cheered. This wasn't that kind of town. Justice here didn't wear a parade, it wore work boots and showed up again the next day to finish what it started. Samuel cleared his throat. Let's get you home, he told Clara. Not the big house. The barn home. Mart'll meet us there. They walked the short distance together, Clara in the middle, Juniper brushing her sleeve with his shoulder now and then as if reminding her of something as basic as gravity. The sky went a deeper blue, the kind that makes you think of wells and hymnals. Swallows cut fast arcs over the pasture, stitching the air back together where the day had torn it. In the barn, Samuel set a chair in the aisle and brought a pail of warm water and a clean cloth. He didn't fuss. He didn't ask for more of the story than she could give. He tended to practicalities, dry socks, broth warming on the tackroom stove, a clean blanket for the loft. Juniper watched each movement with the specific, intent attention that makes you feel less alone simply because something else is paying close, patient mind. Marta Gable arrived with a black bag that looked like it had attended more births than the town's church had baptisms. She was small, deliberate, with hands that telegraphed competence and a voice that could quiet a panicked room without raising a decibel. She examined Clara in the tack room with Samuel standing guard outside like an old tree. When she emerged, she gave a nod that felt like a hand on the shoulder. "She's dehydrated," Marta said, "and wrung out, and strong as rope. Baby's heart is steady. They both need food, sleep, and people who will not lie to them. Sheriff says you've got the last part in hand." Samuel grunted. "We'll manage the rest." Marta paused at Juniper's stall on her way out. She reached up and rubbed the horse's forehead with a knuckle the way horse people do when they think no one is looking. "Good lad," she said, "not for anyone's benefit but his." He blinked slow in reply. Night edged in. The barn took on that deep, resonant quiet that isn't empty so much as full of the right sounds, the steady grind of a horse chewing hay, the soft thump of a tail, the occasional creak of old timbers settling into a darkness they trusted. From the loft, Clara watched a ribbon of moonlight fall across Juniper's back, making a pale river she wanted to wade in. She pulled the blanket to her chin and closed her eyes. Outside, the town sat with what it had witnessed. Inside a cell that smelled faintly of bleach and last week's coffee, William Harrow tried to sleep in a bed that told the truth about status. He turned his face to the wall and discovered the hard lesson men of his type learn at last: money can buy silence, but not the right kind. Not the quiet inside a person who has done the courageous, ordinary thing. Not the hush in a barn where a girl and a horse breathe in time. Not the peace that follows sentences like "I will tell the truth." Near midnight, a figure in a hoodie slipped a small bouquet of wildflowers through the gap in the barn door. No note, just the rough arrangement of things that grow without permission: Queen Anne's lace, yarrow, a little spray of purple vetch. Samuel found it on his last walk through and set it in an old mason jar on the loft steps where Clara would see it when she rose. He looked at Juniper and shook his head, smiling a tired smile. "Town's with you, lad," he said. Juniper breathed out, steam ghosting in the cool air. He lowered himself, not all the way down, not yet, because guardianship has its own body language, but far enough that anyone watching would know a promise had been made and was being kept. He dozed, woke, dozed again, his ear flicking whenever the loft rustled. He dreamed, maybe, of the river road, horse's dream, and in his dream the ditch was only a fold in the land a friend needed help crossing. When the hour turned and the barn clock ticked the kind of time that doesn't belong to business deals or headlines, Clara stirred, woke, and lay still, listening. She could hear the horse's breath, the barn's slow exhale, her own heart counting down the distance to morning. She thought of the square, of the cuffs, of the look on her father's face as the world he'd built tilted, and she wondered what part of him could be salvaged and what part had always been too brittle to bend. She did not decide. That would be work for another day, maybe for another courtroom, maybe for the private courtroom inside a person where verdicts are not read aloud. For now, the twist of the day had resolved into something firm enough to stand on. Juniper had brought the law to the place. The place had given up its evidence. The town had watched without flinching. And somewhere between the ditch and the square, the story had shifted its center of gravity from shame to witness. Clara rolled to her side and watched the white line of horse through the slats. "You stayed," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Juniper or the universe or the part of herself that had refused to go under. Juniper flicked an ear, heard, if not understood in the human way, and blew a soft note into the dark. Morning would come. With it, arraignment. With it, the long, ordinary work of healing. But tonight, a barn was enough like a sanctuary to count, and a horse's presence was a kind of prayer that required no words. The morning in Ash Hollow began the way it often did, slow, with the sun reluctant to rise fully over the hills. But there was a quiet tension in the air, the kind that says a town has unfinished business. Clara woke in the loft above the barn to the sound of Juniper shifting in his stall. The white horse let out a low nicker when she stirred, as if greeting her into the day. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, glancing toward the mason jar of wildflowers on the steps. Someone had thought of her in the night. She sat up slowly, the stiffness in her body reminding her that yesterday hadn't been a bad dream. Down below, Samuel was already moving, the aroma of coffee rising up through the slats. "Morning," he called, his voice deep with the gravel of years. "Morning," Clara replied, her voice still soft with sleep. By the time she'd washed and dressed, the barn was warm with the smell of fresh hay. Samuel handed her a steaming mug. "Sheriff's coming by after the arraignment. Says he wants to give you an update in person." Clara nodded, a small knot forming in her chest. She wasn't afraid of the legal process, not anymore. But she knew that today would make everything final. Her father's actions would be read into record, his charges spoken in a room where the whole town could hear. She looked at Juniper. He stood calmly, his coat catching a beam of sunlight through the open door. There was no judgment in him, only presence. She walked to his stall and rested her forehead against his. "I don't know how I'll feel when it's over," she whispered. Juniper breathed warm air into her hair, the way he always did when she needed grounding. By mid-morning, the sheriff's truck crunched over the gravel drive. Alan stepped out, his hat pulled low against the brightening sun. His expression was measured, but his eyes were softer than they'd been yesterday. "It's done," he said simply. "He's being held without bail. Trial will come soon enough." Clara swallowed, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. "Did he say anything?" "Not much," Alan admitted. "But the evidence is clear. The court heard enough to keep him where he is." Samuel let out a quiet breath beside her, like air leaking from a long-sealed room. "Then that's that," he said. Alan looked at Clara. "What happens now is yours to decide. You've got a home here as long as you want it." In the weeks that followed, the rhythms of life settled into something steadier. Clara stayed in the barn loft, helping Samuel with the daily chores. She learned to repair tack, to mend fences, to read the subtle language of horses beyond Juniper. Word of what had happened spread beyond Ash Hollow, carried by the kind of whispers that turn into stories. But in town, people were careful with her. They didn't pry. They showed their support in quieter ways: a warm pie left on the tackroom table, a newel blanket folded neatly on the loft bed, a handwritten note tucked into her feed order that simply said, "We're glad you're here." Juniper became something of a local legend. Children stopped by the fence to see him, their hands full of apples or carrots. He accepted their offerings politely, but his real loyalty never wavered. His eyes always returned to Clara, as if counting her in every time she came into view. The baby came in late spring, after the first flush of wildflowers had dotted the fields. Marta Gable delivered him right there in the barn loft, with the doors flung open to let the breeze through. Samuel waited below, pacing, and Juniper stood in the next stall, ears twitching at every sound. When it was over, and the small, strong cry filled the space, Clara laughed through her tears. "It's a boy," she said to Juniper, as if he'd been waiting to know. She named the child Gabriel, a name for strength, for messengers, for beginnings that refused to bow to endings. On the first warm evening of summer, the town gathered quietly in the courthouse square. There was no official proclamation, no parade. Just neighbors who wanted to mark a turning point. A local woodworker had carved a small plaque for the pasture gate. "Juniper, for loyalty beyond words." Clara stood with Gabriel in her arms, Samuel at her side. Juniper, free of halter or lead, stepped forward and lowered his head to sniff the baby's tiny hand. The crowd watched in silence, as if afraid to break the spell. Clara's voice was steady when she spoke, though her heart swelled with the weight of it. "This horse saved my life, and my son's life. He stayed when others left. And I think that's the only legacy worth having, staying for the people who need you, no matter the cost." As the sun sank behind the hills, the people drifted back to their homes. Clara lingered at the gate with Juniper, the warm air full of the smell of grass and the sound of crickets beginning their song. She ran her hand down his neck, feeling the strength beneath the skin. "We're all right now," she whispered. "Because of you." Juniper flicked his tail lazily, as if to say he'd only done what was expected. And in that quiet moment, Clara understood something that would carry her for the rest of her days: that love and loyalty are not measured in grand gestures or wealth, but in the simple, stubborn act of staying. Some leave when the road turns hard. Others walk beside you until the road becomes yours again. And if you're lucky, you'll have a Juniper to remind you which kind you are.